Good evening, my name is Deborah King. I'm Pedagogy Pioneer for Scottish Borders Council. Welcome to the session this evening on good practice in mathematics. So when thinking about good practice in mathematics, I took as my starting point the document What is Working in Numeracy and Maths, which is published by Education Scotland. And in that document it says that there's emerging evidence of a positive impact when pedagogy ensures children gain a depth of understanding rather than relying on procedures and algorithms. And that basically just means that children understand what they're doing in maths instead of just learning the procedures for working things out. Manipulatives are used to support understanding, so if children need to use manipulatives, concrete materials, that is absolutely fine for them to use, and also into first and second level. The concrete pictorial abstract model is promoted, so children move from learning using concrete materials onto pictorial and then to the abstract. Mathematical reasoning is developed through use of a variety of approaches, for example bar modelling or non-routine tasks, so that you've got a variety of approaches going in there for children to use. And discussion of strategies is encouraged through talking about number calculations. So that's about making sure that you have the kind of classroom environment where that rich mathematical discussion is taking place. I then started to think about what this looks like in more detail and what this means on a practical level in your classroom. And to get more detail, the Education Endowment Foundation published 2 guidance reports in mathematics. So I had a look through these and they summarise the best available evidence and make clear actionable recommendations for teachers and practitioners. So from that, what they recommend is to use assessment to build on pupils' existing knowledge and understanding. So that is using assessment as part of your teaching to establish where children are and where they need to go, their next steps. Again, use of manipulatives and representatives. Sometimes children are moved on a little bit too quickly. If that foundation's not there and that's still something that they need, then they should still be using it. To teach pupils strategies for problem solving. So that means not just giving them problems, getting them to work the problem out, but actually giving them a toolkit of strategies that they can apply to any problem, and they can apply that in different situations. Enabling pupils to develop a rich mathematical knowledge, which is around, as I said before, having those rich discussions around mathematics. Develop pupils' independence and motivation. So ensuring that pupils can do things by themselves. So given the right levels of support and also giving them tasks that motivate and engage them, and to use tasks and resources to challenge and support pupils' mathematics. So that's about making sure again that you know where your pupils are and making sure that there's the right amount of challenge, but also there's the support there if pupils need it. Use structured interventions to provide additional support. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail further on, but just making sure that if pupils need maths intervention, that you are using appropriate resources and approaches. And lastly, support pupils to make successful transition between primary and secondary school. So that is key for pupils to further their learning when they go into secondary, making sure that that transition is nice and smooth. So the information that I've given previously has informed my practice, and so I've created a list of 8 things that I believe to be good practice in mathematics, informed by what I've said already. And these are things that I use in my own classroom and things that have been very effective with the pupils in my class. I won't read the list to you, I'll let you read that for yourself. and I'll go into more detail with some aspects of this as we move on. Now, there wouldn't be time to go into all of the areas in detail, so what I've decided to do for this session is to focus on 3 key areas and describe good practice within those 3 key areas. So the first area being number 7 on the previous list, using effective interventions, and I'm going to talk about a maths intervention project that I was involved in and give examples of what we did and what we found from the project. Also, I'm going to talk about maths intervention in early years through SEIL Maths, and that is going to be through what we do in the school that I currently work in. Secondly, use of concrete pictorial abstract model, which is number 3 on the list, and I'm going to talk about dual coding approach in mathematics, which is something that we use in the school that I work in. And lastly, rich discussion around strategies for calculations, developing independence and motivation. So that is number 5 on the previous list. And I'm going to talk about how to have those rich discussions around strategies for calculations. And I'm going to give examples of what we do through number talks. So I'm going to start by talking about the maths intervention project that I was part of, and thinking about what we were hoping to achieve and why we were doing this. I'll refer back to what I've previously spoke about, which is the What is Working in Numeracy and Maths document. It states that the biggest impacts observed are when a school or secondary department work together to review their teaching and learning, plan collaboratively, reflect and review changes, and that's really what we did throughout this project. So we carried out a research project as principal teachers looking to improve our practice around maths intervention, resources and approaches. So we had to start by thinking about what maths intervention actually should look like, and what are we aiming for here. So I went back to the Education Endowment Foundation document that I mentioned before, and under section 7, which was the recommendation, use structured interventions to provide additional support, it gave a few more details on what that looks like in more depth, which I've listed below there. I'm not going to read that all out to you, you can read that for yourself. But we took this as a starting point for what we were actually looking for and what we wanted to achieve. So from all of this, we decided really that what maths intervention is all about is that it should be part of teaching, learning and assessment cycle, and it's a process that would identify first of all any gaps in learning. We also spoke about the fact that within maths especially, because there are so many areas to it that are so different, that there can be gaps in some areas and not in others, and it's about how to support pupils through these areas. We also decided that early intervention is key, but that then raised the question of how we do this and how is best to do this. We talked about use of formative assessment, tracking and monitoring, observations and discussions as a way of really informing our practice in this area. And through my own research, I've found this to be an approach. So we didn't want to just focus purely on resources. We wanted to look at how these resources are used and to actually get out and talk to practitioners about what they have found in their own experience and what is the best way forward with this. So in terms of what we then did, so as a group we decided to go and visit other schools within the authority, and we decided that it would be best to go to primary and secondary schools, and we spoke to practitioners both within and out with the authority who had used various resources, just so that we sort of were able to decide what we wanted to go and see and talk to people about. The resources that we observed were the SEIC Maths, which stands for Stages of Early Arithmetical Learning in primary, and Success in Arithmetic in secondary. And the schools that I went to were West Linton Primary School and People's High School. My colleagues went to different schools, and the model of it was that we would go and observe whole class teaching, small group one-to-one intervention work. We also had a good look through the resources that I mentioned and recorded how these were used in the different schools. We had discussions with pupils and discussions with staff, and then we met together to discuss our findings across the different schools. So what we found through doing this research was that maths intervention is best when it's used as part of the process of learning, teaching and assessment, and it's ongoing and regularly evaluated. So it's not something that just happens in isolation, it's something that is ongoing throughout the teaching and learning process. We found interestingly that the types of maths intervention varied greatly between primary and secondary, and what we observed was that that was due to the needs of the children being very different at secondary to at primary, but that they varied only slightly within the primary schools that we went to. The resources were used in different ways according to the needs of the children, which is really good, and it's really what you'd expect, that, you know, if a child has specific needs, that the resources were targeted towards those needs. The key thing that we all found was that it was as much about how the resources were used rather than the resources themselves. So things like having children in small groups was key, and having an adult to work with these children in a one-to-one or a one-to-two situation really had a lot of impact. So yes, the resources that we saw being used were important, but it was more about how they were being used that had the positive impact. Also, sharing understanding of where the children are and what we are expecting of them is key. So that means that making sure that the adults had a shared understanding of where the children were, especially if other adults were coming to work with the children in small groups, that everybody knew where they were and what they needed to learn, but also that the children knew where they were and what they needed to learn. We said that additional adult support, we found, made a huge difference as well. In terms of having things in place for tracking and monitoring, that was very important. So things like having benchmarks, progression, tracking documentation to support the teaching and learning was very, very important. And as I've said before, that it was an approach, it wasn't just about schemes and resources. So from that research, what we then decided in the school that I currently work in is that we were going to focus on using SEIC Maths in early years as an intervention approach, that we would continue to use number talks in P3 to P7 to teach understanding of maths and allow for the rich discussion of strategies for calculations, and that we would use dual coding approach. So we'll start by looking at SEIC Maths in early years. SEIC stands for Stages of Early Arithmetical Learning. So where it actually came from was when Dr. Robert White began developing the Maths Recovery Programme in 1992. I won't read all of that slide for you, I'll let you read what it says for yourself. Really, what that's showing is that children develop and acquire strategies and numerical knowledge through a series of different stages, and these are the stages of early arithmetical learning. It looks at the relative sophistication of children's strategies for dealing with number and allows teachers to deal with these. And also by using this approach, we can ensure that learners have a firm foundation for understanding number, and it ensures that their strategies are based on understanding rather than just the processes or the tricks. So I'll take you through the stages of SEIL Maths. As I said, it's a progression that gets more complex as the child moves through the stages. So it begins with emergent, so that's attempting to count, maybe not understanding all counting tasks, maybe not knowing all the number words. The child may not be able to coordinate words with items necessarily, and the child may not have the organisational skills. So it's right at the emergent stage of just exploring number and counting. Then they would move on to perceptual, so can count perceived items, may involve seeing, hearing or feeling items, so might need the concrete material in front of them, and may create perceptual replacements for abstract problems. Then we move on to the figurative stage, so can count the total of 2 screened collections and possibly solved abstract questions like what is 5 plus 4. Counts from 1 to solve the problem. So for example, if you ask what is 13 add 3, the child would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Then they'd move on to initial number sequence. So child uses, and the key thing is, and understands counting on rather than counting from 1. So would, with the previous example there, 13 add 3, they would start at 13 and go 14, 15, 16. Uses counting on to solve additive tasks and counting up to solve missing add-end tasks, and may use count down from strategies, so maybe starting to use that, and use an intermediate number sequence. Then they would move on to intermediate number sequence, so the child can use and understand count down from strategies and count down to strategies. So counting down from a given number and counting down to a given number. The child can choose the most effective strategy. So for example, 16 take away 3, 16, 15, 14, 13 would be your counting back. 16 take away 14, 16, 15, 14, count back 2. And then the facile stage. At this stage, the child uses a range of non-count by 1 strategies, which are on the slide there. So as we've said before, assessment is key in the process of identifying where the children's needs are, and within SEIL there are clear assessment grids to identify what stage children are at, and these are to be used as part of the learning, teaching and assessment cycle. Now I'm sorry these haven't come up very clearly, but the white grid on the bottom of the slide there is where you would add names to the chart and highlight where you think the children are. Use this as your starting point for assessing, and you just progress along the chart until you identify how advanced their number strategies are and finish where they're secure. And then from that it identifies for you what stage the children are at, and that would be your starting point. And you would start the teaching from there. So that was a very brief run through of SEIL Maths and how we use it in early years. Alongside that though, what we have been using in school is to support the concrete pictorial abstract model, which has been shown to be highly effective. We have been using information from the dual coding theory. Now this comes from a book which was written by Oliver Caviglioli, and his work is based on Pavo's dual coding theory. And what this basically means is that he had an understanding of the fact that we have two streams of information coming into our brains when we are learning. So there are two information channels that feed our working memory, and that's what we use every day when we are learning, and they are visual and verbal. Now, according to Pavo, the verbal stores logins and the non-verbal, i.e. the visual, stores imagens. Okay. So what that means is we receive information visually and we receive information verbally. Now, these two things are separate, yet they're connected, and Oliver Caviglioli actually said that the reason that they are separate is so that if you are in the dark, you can still hear, basically. So they are separate to each other, they would work without one another, but also they are working together at the same time. There's a mechanism that ensures they can work in tandem. This tethering of visual and verbal does not involve any transfer of information from one to the other. Instead, one channel triggers a connection with the other. Okay, so what is key here is that the two channels differ in another significant way. Verbal information must be processed sequentially, with all the constraints and effort that entails. Visual information, by contrast, is organised synchronously, which means details, their links, and the big picture can be perceived simultaneously. So you get the picture kind of all at once. The memory cycle, the last part, the content of our working memory can move to our long-term memory. So that's where information is learned, basically. We call this process encoding. When visual and verbal information is strongly connected, we have what is known as dual coding. This double memory trace greatly aids its later retrieval from long-term memory back into working memory. So basically, if these things are connected, then they go into the long-term memory and they're more easily retrieved from the long-term memory. So an extension to the dual coding theory is the visual argument, and that highlights the cognitive advantages of presenting information in nonlinear spatial configurations. So basically, the brain finds it easier to process information when it is laid out in a certain way. The example on the right-hand side shows this perfectly. So you've got information on the Modern Europe project, and it is presented in two different ways. So one is a paragraph of information, and the second one is a hierarchical diagram. So I'm not going to read it for you, but it gives the same information in two different ways. And if you were asked the questions, so who is the highest ranking person in the Modern Europe project, it is a lot easier to identify the answer by looking at the diagram than by having to read through that paragraph. Which department has the most people in the Modern Europe project? Which people are not involved with the Modern Europe project? Again, all much easier to actually answer at a glance when you look at the diagram. Now, I would really have liked if you could have been able to come in and observe in my class us using this in practice, but because of the COVID situation and the home learning, we kind of are where we are with that. So what I've done is I've included some examples of dual coding from the children's work. And one of these on the left-hand side is a Venn diagram. So this pupil is showing the similarities and differences of houses in Spain and the UK. Now again, if she were to write that as a paragraph, it's difficult to actually pick these things out, whereas by showing it in the Venn diagram, you can quickly just see at a glance the differences and then the similarities in the middle there. As well on the right hand side, so this pupil was learning about times tables that give the same answer. So by use of colour, she has shown the times tables that give the answer 16 to be in purple, the times tables that give the answer 35 to be in red, etc. And it's a really easy visual way of showing their learning and understanding, and it's easier for someone else to come along and to process that information very quickly. So the previous slide there shows the visual argument aspect of the dual coding, where the pupils are presenting their work in such a way that it's easier for the brain to process. What I'm going to show you now is an example of excellent practice from a Primary 1-2 class within the school that I currently work in. And this video clip shows a great example of the teacher using dual coding and also using SEAL maths in action. So we're now going to move on to talking about how we develop that rich discussion around mathematical knowledge and strategies within the classroom. And what I'm going to talk about and show you is the resource of Number Talks and how I have used this in second level. So Number Talks is an approach that has been very effective. It develops understanding. It also allows for use of concrete pictorial abstract and focuses mainly on discussion of strategies and mathematical reasoning. It starts off very simple and moves into more complex problems, and it also, interestingly, allows for discussion of correct and incorrect answers. So when delivering staff training on Number Talks, we've taken the information from Number Talks Whole Number Computation by Sherry Parish. She describes the intent of Number Talks, not to teach strategies, but to provide a platform for students to invent, construct and make sense of important foundations in number. The key components are the environment and community. I've spoken about that, making sure that children feel they're able to discuss what they are thinking. Classroom discussion, so ensuring the richness of discussion so that children are gaining understanding. The teacher's role, so the teacher being the person that facilitates the discussion. The role of mental maths, so ensuring that children have the skills to be able to take part in the mental maths activities within the Number Talks, and purposeful computation problems for the children. A Number Talk's designed to only be 5 to 15 minutes in duration, so we're not talking about whole lessons here, we're talking about something that's perhaps done at the start or at the end of the lesson. So further to that, 4 procedures and expectations essential to Number Talks are to select a designated location that allows you to maintain close proximity for informal observations and interactions. So it should feel just like a discussion group with your class, and it should feel quite informal so that children are able to share ideas quite openly. Provide an appropriate wait time for the majority of students to access the problem, so not just asking them to give an answer immediately and putting pressure on students. It shouldn't feel that way. Accept, respect and consider all answers. So even if a child gives you a wrong answer, to accept that answer and to actually explore that with the group is very important, so that children can see perhaps where they've gone wrong and can also see a way of thinking that they might not have considered themselves, and then to explore why you might have an incorrect answer. At what point could you identify where you've gone wrong is a very, very useful discussion to have. Encourage student communication through Number Talks, and make sure that students are all communicating with you and that you give each child, maybe not every single lesson, but throughout the course of the lesson, a chance to share their thinking with you. As students share each computation strategy, the teacher should record individual student thinking in a clear and concise manner. And I've done this through just on the whiteboard, just very simply jotting down what the student has said to me, or inviting the student to come out and them to write it on the whiteboard. Having a system of accountability built into the Number Talks process ensures that each student is mentally participating. So making sure that, for example, when students have the answer, that they maybe give a wee thumbs up. So you're not getting all of the answers all together and all of the strategies all together, because that would take far too long. But if you have that system in place, then you can see very clearly who has worked the problem out or who has the strategy in their head. And making sure that manipulatives are available but not imposed is important, especially if a student's having difficulty. So to be able to say to them, you know, you can go and get your number line, or you can go and get some cubes if that would help you to contribute to the discussion, and just being quite open about that and just ensuring that pupils can go and do that if they need to is very important. It kind of takes the pressure off of a lot of pupils worrying about that, so it's important that they feel comfortable enough to do that. 5 small steps towards teaching for understanding in Number Talks. So start with a smaller problem to elicit thinking from multiple perspectives. So basically, if the problem is small and quite simple, then you'll tend to get a bigger response from more pupils. Whereas if you start with something that's quite complex, a lot of pupils are reluctant to share their thinking in case they make a mistake. Be prepared to offer a strategy from a previous student. So if you're finding that someone is maybe struggling to come up with something, you could say, oh, well, what about what we discussed before? How about trying it this way? It's all right to put a student strategy on the back burner. So say to them, that's great, we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's have a think about another way of doing it. As a rule, limit your Number Talks 5 to 15 minutes, like I've said, and this shouldn't take up a lot of time. It should be short and frequent. And be patient with yourself and your students as you incorporate Number Talks into your regular math time. So it does take a bit of getting used to, but once that system is in place, children start to understand the process, they become quicker at it, and in the case of my class, they start to look forward to it and they really enjoy it. So I've included some examples of Number Talks that I've done with children in my class. So these are basic, quite simple questions, and what children have done is they have shown how they would work something out, and then I've asked them to think of another way of working out that same problem. And this is really good for building up strategies in their heads. So we've got some subtraction sums on the left-hand side and some addition sums on the right-hand side. And as you can see, this pupil has thought of different ways. They've used some of the same ways, which is a good starting point for discussion. Oh, you've used that strategy before and that was effective. Why did you use that one again? Why did you use something different? And these are all super ways of showing their learning. What I did do as well is I gave them a wee bank of strategies to start with, and I found that to be effective because it started them off, and especially the ones that weren't too confident, it gave them a starting place. These examples show how we have done Number Talks through home learning. So this student has shown different ways that she has worked out the answers to different calculations, as you can see, and she has included little audio clips of her explaining how she worked out these answers as well. So these examples show, firstly, the one on the left-hand side, where the pupil has used a bit of a number line to help them to work out the problem. So that's what I was saying before about using the concrete materials manipulatives but not imposing it. So I didn't say that she had to, but she's felt that this was a way that she could use to actually help her work it out, and she's shown me that. And also on the right hand side, the far right, is the game of Countdown, which is perfect for number talks. And we had an example of when we were doing this as a class for home learning, there were children and parents taking part in the countdown, really enjoying it, and then discussing how they got the answers, which is, you know, what it's all about. And it's a very sort of informal, fun way of doing number talks. So I've now included a video clip which shows the teacher using number talks in a class setting with a group of children. So that brings me to the end of this presentation, and I hope you found it useful. I hope that there are some things that you might take away and use in your own classroom, or maybe even some things that you would like more information on, or maybe to research a little bit more yourselves. So what we've looked at tonight is using current research. We've explored the advice at national level along with our own research at local authority level to inform practice. We therefore have a shared understanding of good practice in maths, and we've looked at examples of SEIL maths in early years as an intervention approach, dual coding, and number talks for teaching of mathematical understanding. So that is the end of the session tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. If not, then thank you very much for attending my webinar this evening, and I hope that you have found it useful.